The house was modest, and winter had just begun to press its cold fingers against the city of Chicago. On the 5th day of December in 1901, Walter Elias Disney came quietly into the world. He was the fourth son of Elias and Flora Disney, a child with eyes like windows ready to drink in every moving thing. The house sat on Tripp Avenue, tucked among rows of other working homes, none of them too proud, none of them poor. Elias was a man of stern beliefs. He had been a builder of railroads, a farmer, and a fiddler of dreams that never seemed to quite come true. Flora, in contrast, was soft-spoken, warm, and precise. She had been a schoolteacher before motherhood became her world. Together, they were ordinary people, though not without their quiet hopes. When Walt was 4, the Disneys left the factory hum of Chicago behind and moved to the rolling hills of Missouri. They settled in Marceline, a small town with streets dusted by wagon wheels and shaded by tall oaks that swayed in the hush of summer. Here the air was slower and sweeter. There were fields, fences, and the distant call of train whistles. Marceline felt like a painted picture, its corners tucked with simple pleasures and the kind of quiet that lingered between heartbeats. Walt's days unfolded in rhythms familiar to any farm child. There were chores to tend to, chickens to feed, and long hours under a big, watchful sky. Yet even then, something in him tilted toward make-believe. He would lie on his belly in the grass and sketch with sticks in the dirt. He watched animals with an attentiveness that bordered on reverence. Cows seemed curious, pigs were grumpy, and birds held secret opinions about everything. His older brothers worked and planned and eventually left. Roy, the one closest to Walt in both age and affection, joined the Navy. Walt stayed behind with his younger sister Ruth and their parents, his imagination filling the space they left. He drew constantly, on scraps, in margins, on walls when no one was looking. His world became one of lines and shapes that suggested laughter, motion, and joy. There was one day in Marceline that stayed with Walt long after he had grown tall. A traveling theatrical troupe came to town and set up a little show in the local opera house. The curtain lifted, and for the first time, he saw what magic looked like on a stage. The gaslights shimmered. Costumes turned people into creatures. The audience held its breath together. Walt's heart thudded like it had discovered something ancient and new. He didn't know what it was called, this feeling of transport and wonder, but he knew he wanted to stay there. Another marvel soon entered his life. Motion pictures. Silent, flickering, and often full of slapstick nonsense. They delighted young Walt in a way no toy ever had. He was transfixed by how still images could suddenly move, and how characters who could not speak could still make the whole room laugh. Charlie Chaplin became a kind of invisible mentor. Walt copied his expressions, practiced his waddles, and laughed alone in the backyard until his sides ached. Marceline also brought him his first audience. He drew a horse for the local doctor who admired the lines and encouraged him to keep at it. A neighbor even paid him a nickel for a sketch, a tiny thing, but one that confirmed a fragile hope. Maybe the pictures he carried in his mind were worth sharing. Maybe they mattered. But as childhoods do, this chapter ended too soon. Elias, always chasing steadier income, decided to move the family again, this time to Kansas City. The town was larger, noisier, and less enchanted. The farm was sold, and with it, Walt's fields of dreams became distant. Marceline would remain a golden place in his memory, untouched by time or disappointment. It was there that he first tasted the alchemy of imagination, and he would spend the rest of his life trying to recapture it. Kansas City was a place of motion. The clatter of streetcars, the hiss of steam, the hum of crowds. It all seemed louder than Marceline's hush. Walt was still a boy, but now he was expected to be something more. Elias, ever practical, bought a paper route. It was Walt's job, alongside his brother Roy when he was home, to deliver stacks of newspapers across neighborhoods that sprawled beyond what a child's legs should endure. Mornings came before the sun. In the dark cold, Walt would rise, pull on layers, and step into streets still blanketed in sleep. The bag was heavy. Sometimes it pulled him sideways, but he trudged on, porch to porch, step by step, and though he never truly complained, the strain stayed with him. It would later resurface in dreams and drawings, tired eyes, hopeful smiles, and characters carrying more than their size should bear. After school, if there was time, Walt would draw. He joined the school newspaper, sketching little cartoons and filling margins with movement. When his father let him, he took correspondence courses in illustration. He studied comic strips in the local papers and copied them again and again until the shapes became muscle memory. It was in this period that Walt began to drift, at least in spirit. School held little magic. His grades were uneven. Teachers noted his talent, but didn't always know what to do with it. The rules of grammar and geography could never compete with the lure of a pencil in his hand. Still, he obeyed the path laid before him, until the world shifted. In 1917, as the shadows of World War I deepened, Roy enlisted in the Navy. Walt, still underage, longed to follow. He tried the military, but was turned away. Determined not to be left behind, he altered his birth certificate and joined the Red Cross Ambulance Corps. At just 16, he boarded a ship bound for France. He never saw battle, but the experience marked him all the same. He drove ambulances through the cracked roads of post-war Europe. The vehicles were clumsy and slow. The people he passed were quiet and tired. In moments between duties, Walt sketched what he saw. French villages, ruined churches, weary faces. He also decorated his ambulance with cartoons and painted figures on the walls of his barracks. It was a strange contrast, this world of rubble and resilience, paired with the flickers of comedy and color he could not help but bring to it. When he returned to the United States in 1919, he was still barely a man. He had no money, no clear path, but he carried something that had survived all those miles: the need to create. He found work at a commercial art studio, where he met a young illustrator named Ub Iwerks. Together, they began a partnership that would span decades. They were both quiet, both drawn to the craft, and both willing to spend long hours bent over drawings for the smallest of pay. Their early work was modest: advertisements, placards, and occasional bits for theaters. But even in these simple things, Walt saw potential. He wanted to make pictures move, not just drawings that stayed still, but images that came to life, danced, and told stories without a single spoken word. The idea was still new then. Animation existed, but only in brief, crude forms. With a borrowed camera and scraps of film, Walt set up a little studio in his father's garage. He experimented late into the night, creating a short series of cartoons he called laughograms. They were rough, imperfect, but carried his unmistakable joy. Cats blinked, mice scurried, and the humor was gentle even when the drawings wobbled. Walt began to imagine a future for these sketches, not as novelties, but as a kind of language. He believed animation could be art. It could make people feel, not just giggle. But turning dreams into dollars was not simple. His little company, built on hope and borrowed funds, quickly ran into debt. The clients were few. The expenses grew. One by one, animators left. Still, even as the walls closed in, Walt didn't stop drawing. He slept in the studio. He scrounged for meals. He kept moving his pencil, frame by frame. Because somewhere in that flicker of motion, he saw a way forward. A new kind of storytelling was waiting to be born. All he had to do was hold on a little longer. The studio was just a room with mismatched furniture and more hope than equipment. It sat in a Kansas City office building that smelled faintly of floor polish and rain. Walt called it Laugh-O-Gram Films. It was a name meant to sound cheerful and full of energy. At times it was, but more often it echoed with the kind of silence that comes when bills are due and the next project hasn't yet arrived. Still, for a time, it pulsed with promise. Walt had gathered a handful of young animators around him. Boys, really, many barely older than he was. They worked elbow to elbow, often late into the night, creating short cartoons meant for local theaters. There were princesses and frogs, kittens and cabbages. The stories were whimsical and fast-paced, often stitched together with a kind of scrappy charm that made them endearing even when the drawings stuttered. One of Walt's favorites was Little Red Riding Hood. It was a new take on the old tale, filled with playful gags and surprise twists. It didn't pay much, but it got laughs. And those laughs, however brief, were fuel. Walt believed that if he could just keep going, something bigger would come. He wrote letters to distributors. He sent reels to theaters farther and farther away. The world still felt wide, but he was learning how to reach it, inch by inch. Money, though, was never enough. Rent fell behind. Staff sometimes went unpaid. Walt would give his last coins to keep the lights on and then skip meals to make up the difference. He once traded his beloved camera for cash to pay animators. He believed so strongly in the work that it hurt him more to see someone go hungry than to lose a piece of equipment. Sacrifice became second nature. In the quiet hours, when everyone else had gone home, Walt would sit at his desk and sketch. His lines grew cleaner, his ideas bolder. He was learning not just how to animate, but how to lead, how to coax more from a scene than anyone expected, how to see the heartbeat inside a character. But the tide would not wait. One by one, Laugh-O-Gram's clients stopped calling. A major distribution deal fell through, and the last few reels sat unclaimed in their canisters. In the summer of 1923, the studio shut its doors. Walt was just 21. He had no savings, no studio, and no clear plan. But he still had his drawings, and more than that, he had a strange kind of faith, the kind that doesn't waver, even when logic says it should. He bought a one-way train ticket to California. He packed what little he had, including a short film called Alice's Wonderland, which blended live action and animation. It featured a young girl interacting with cartoon characters in a dreamlike world. It was playful, strange, and full of possibility. California felt like a new beginning. The train rolled through flat plains and desert heat before climbing into the hills of Los Angeles. The city was not yet the dream machine it would become, but it buzzed with industry. Silent films were booming, studios were growing, and somewhere in all of that noise, Walt believed there might be a place for his kind of magic. He moved in with his uncle and began knocking on doors. Some producers laughed politely. Others dismissed him. But finally, a small distributor named Margaret Winkler showed interest in Alice's Wonderland. She saw something fresh in the mix of live action and cartoons. A contract was signed. Walt had his first real break. He called Roy. His brother had just recovered from tuberculosis and was looking for something new. They joined forces again, just as they had in the quiet mornings of Kansas City. With a handshake and a dream, they started a small studio together. The Disney Brothers Studio. It was a small name, in a small room, on a small budget. But something had begun to bloom. The drawings were still simple. The paychecks were still thin. But now, there was a roof overhead, a partner by his side, and the first glimmer of a future that no longer felt so far away. The Disney Brothers Studio began in a rented office space on Kingswell Avenue in Los Angeles. It wasn't much to look at. 2 rooms above a real estate office, with squeaky floors and walls thin enough to hear the footsteps of neighbors. But it held a desk, a camera stand, and Walt's tireless optimism. That was enough. Walt and Roy were opposites in many ways. Walt dreamed aloud. He talked in colors and characters, in ideas that leapt ahead of the budget. Roy, quieter and more measured, handled the books and held the line. They argued, but they trusted each other more than anyone else in the world. Walt knew that with Roy, dreams had a better chance of staying upright. The Alice comedies were their first shared success. Young Virginia Davis played the curious girl who wandered into cartoon lands. Each short was hand-animated frame by frame, with hours of work poured into every minute. The process was grueling, but Walt didn't mind. To him, each frame was a doorway, and he meant to walk through all of them. Virginia's parents eventually moved away, but the series continued with other child actors stepping into the same magical role. The stories were simple and strange. Animals playing baseball, cars with personalities, forests that whispered secrets. Each episode was more confident than the last. The audience grew. So did the team. Walt hired a few more animators. Among them was Iwerks, who had come from Kansas City and quickly became the studio's most gifted draftsman. Had a quiet brilliance. His hands moved faster than most could watch. Walt would describe a scene, and would draw it as if it had always existed. Their rhythm was like a duet, idea and execution flowing back and forth. With the impossible began to look easy. As the studio found its footing, Walt began to think bigger. He didn't just want to amuse people, he wanted to astonish them. The cartoons needed more than jokes. They needed feeling. They needed timing. Above all, they needed characters who felt alive. He watched animals at the zoo and studied how they moved. He made animators act out scenes in front of mirrors, trying to capture not just action, but emotion. By 1926, the business had grown enough to warrant a name change. The Disney Brothers Studio became simply Walt Disney Studio. Roy didn't mind. He knew that Walt's name had already become a kind of promise to audiences, a shorthand for whimsy and wonder. But, as with every climb, the higher they went, the more fragile it felt. Their distributor, Margaret Winkler, had married a man named Charles Mintz. He was a shrewd businessman, and in time he took over the contract. Walt, ever eager to grow, pitched him a new idea, a cheerful, wide-eyed rabbit named Oswald. Oswald, the lucky rabbit, was a hit. With his floppy ears and bouncy energy, he became the studio's first real star. Audiences loved him. Studios took notice. Walt was sure they were finally secure. He poured his attention into the Oswald series, crafting stories that danced with joy and cleverness. But trouble came quietly. Mintz had his own plans. In early 1928, when Walt traveled to New York to renegotiate their deal, he was met not with gratitude, but with betrayal. Mintz revealed that he had secretly hired away most of Walt's animators. Worse still, he claimed the rights to Oswald. The character Walt had created no longer belonged to him. Walt sat in the hotel lobby after the meeting, stunned. Everything they'd built felt like it had slipped through his fingers. He wrote to Roy. He wrote to Lillian, his wife. He did not cry. He did not yell, but he made a quiet decision. They might take his rabbit, but they would never take his spirit. On the train ride back to California, something new began to stir inside him. A different kind of character, smaller, friendlier, with a mischievous grin. He drew it in his lap as the train rumbled through the heartland. A mouse, simple and bright-eyed. He didn't yet know what to call it. But something told him this time. The magic would be theirs alone. The train rocked gently as it moved westward, the clack of wheels a soft rhythm beneath the quiet hum of thought. Walt leaned against the window, sketchpad balanced on his knees. With each mile that passed, he drew. The mouse took shape slowly, almost shyly. Rounded ears, wide, cheerful eyes, a button nose and gloves with 3 fingers. There was something about him that felt familiar, even though he had never been seen before. By the time the train reached Los Angeles, Walt had a new idea, a new character, a new future. Back at the studio, he shared the drawing with iWorks. Ub refined it, gave it polish, and brought it to life frame by frame. They named the character Mortimer at first, but Lillian, Walt's wife, wrinkled her nose at the sound. It was too pompous, she said, too stiff. She suggested another name, one that felt smaller, lighter, friendlier. Mickey. And just like that, the spark caught flame. Mickey Mouse made his official debut in a silent cartoon called Plain Crazy. He danced across the screen with a liveliness that was new and irresistible. But silent cartoons were beginning to fade. The future belonged to sound, and Walt, always watching, always listening, knew what had to come next. The next short was called Steamboat Willie. It featured synchronized sound, laughter, music, and a whistling mouse at the helm of a riverboat. The moment Mickey tapped his foot to the beat and pulled on a steam whistle, something shifted in the air. It wasn't just animation anymore. It was theater. It was rhythm. It was alive. The film premiered in 1928 and dazzled the audience. People laughed and clapped. Some had never seen anything like it. Sound had changed everything. And Mickey Mouse, born of heartbreak and drawn on a train, had become an instant star. Overnight, Mickey appeared everywhere. On theater screens, in newspapers, on watches and notebooks. Walt, who had once traded his camera for cash, was suddenly holding the attention of the nation. But it wasn't just success. It was connection. People saw themselves in Mickey. He was small, scrappy, sometimes unlucky, but always trying, always smiling. And behind that smile was something deeper, a bit of Walt himself. That earnestness, that refusal to give up. Mickey wasn't just a character. He was a mirror of the dreamer who had drawn him. With Mickey's rise, the studio changed. It moved into a larger space on Hyperion Avenue. More animators came. More ideas filled the air. Walt walked the halls with a kind of restlessness, always seeking, always sketching. He introduced new characters, Minnie, Goofy, Donald, each with their own voice, each with their own spirit. He also demanded more of the craft. He pushed his animators to study movement, weight, and timing. He wanted the cartoons to feel not just clever, but real. Every blink, every gesture, every sigh. At the same time, Walt began building a team of musicians and sound artists. He saw cartoons as orchestras, where music, voice, and image played together in perfect harmony. He tested new techniques, experimented with color, and dreamed of making the audience feel something deeper than laughter. Behind the scenes, the work was intense. Deadlines pressed, budgets strained, but Walt held the course. He believed that every frame mattered, that joy was worth the labor. And so, frame by frame, reel by reel, the world of animation shifted. By the early 1930s, the Walt Disney Studio had become the beating heart of American animation. Mickey was known around the world. Children cheered at his antics. Parents smiled at his charm. But inside the studio, Walt's gaze had already moved on. He wanted to tell bigger stories. Stories with depth and shadows. Stories that didn't just entertain, but lingered. The mouse had opened the door. But beyond it, something grand was waiting to be made. The streets of Los Angeles in the mid-1920s shimmered with sun and possibility. Palm trees reached skyward beside silent film studios and dusty boulevards. Walt walked among them with wide eyes and narrow funds, carrying little more than a suitcase and a cartoon reel. The city was bigger than anything he had known. Its corners buzzed with energy, car horns, typewriters, laughter from studio gates. Yet Walt moved through it quietly, focused on the film under his arm and the spark it contained. He stayed with his Uncle Robert, whose house near Kingswell Avenue offered a patch of stability, while Walt began to stitch together the threads of a new life. Days were spent knocking on doors, asking for meetings, showing his reel. The rejections came quickly. Most saw animation as novelty, filler for movie programs, not a future. But Margaret Winkler saw something different. She was one of the few female distributors in the business, a woman with sharp instincts and a willingness to take chances. When she viewed Alice's Wonderland, the reel Walt had made back in Kansas City, she saw promise in its unusual mix of live action and animation. A little girl walking among drawn animals. It felt new, gentle, full of charm. She offered Walt a deal, a series of Alice comedies to be delivered regularly. It was more than he'd hoped for. He wired Roy, who was recovering from illness in a veterans hospital. "Come west," Walt wrote. "I've got to start." Roy came, and with him, the foundation of everything that followed. The brothers were different. Roy with his quiet caution, Walt with his restless vision, but their bond was deep. They scraped together the money to rent a tiny office in the back of a real estate building. It had one window, one phone, and a second-hand camera. It was the beginning of the Disney Brothers studio. Walt handled the animation. Roy managed the business. And bit by bit, the reels were completed. The early episodes of the Alice comedies were simple, whimsical tales. A young girl navigating cartoon dreamlands, chased by mischievous cats or floating through clouds shaped like elephants. They were drawn by hand, every frame a little miracle. Walt slept on a cot beside the desk more often than not. Meals were skipped, deadlines kept. When Virginia Davis, the original Alice, moved away with her family, Walt found new girls to take up the role. The formula remained the same: cheerful stories, bright drawings, a dose of magic in every scene. They didn't make much money, but they made enough to keep going. And in the stillness of late nights, as pencils scratched paper and reels ticked forward, Walt began to think beyond Alice. He wanted more than comedy shorts. He wanted characters who lived not just in jokes, but in hearts. He wanted stories that stretched longer than a minute and touched deeper than a laugh. The studio began to grow. Walt hired new animators, including some from Kansas City. Among them was Ub Iwerks, whose talent was as steady as it was extraordinary. Ub could draw anything, fast, clean, precise. Walt would imagine, and Ub would make it move. Together, they became something rare, a dreamer and a craftsman working in near-perfect rhythm. The Alice comedies gave them both practice and confidence. But Walt knew they wouldn't last forever. He began exploring new ideas, characters that didn't need a live-action anchor, fully animated worlds. A rabbit, perhaps. Something energetic, something they could truly call their own. As the series neared its end, Walt pitched the idea of Oswald, the lucky rabbit. Charles Mintz, who now managed the distribution, approved. Contracts were signed, storyboards drawn. The rabbit hopped onto the screen, and the audience responded. Oswald was cheeky and nimble. He moved with a bounce that felt modern. The cartoons earned smiles in theaters, and with each one, Walt edged closer to something bigger. The studio grew again. More staff, more desks, more dreams. Walt began talking about color, about music, about emotion. The world was shifting, and Walt, still young, still stubborn, was reaching for the edge of it. Oswald was working. Theater owners wanted more. Audiences laughed and leaned in. The rabbit was agile, expressive, and unmistakably alive. For the first time, the studio was running with a sense of rhythm. Animators rotating shifts, stories passed between hands like whispered secrets. Roy kept the ledgers tight. Walt kept the ideas flowing. But success, Walt was learning, carried its own kind of tension. Charles Mintz, now holding the distribution rights through Universal, grew less patient with Walt's insistence on quality. Budgets were questioned. Timelines were squeezed. Walt resisted. He believed each cartoon needed its full breath, its dance of timing, its subtle grace. Mintz disagreed. He saw the rabbit as product. Walt saw him as a performance. In early 1928, with his usual blend of confidence and optimism, Walt boarded a train to New York to renegotiate. He believed the Oswald shorts had proven their worth. He hoped for better terms, more control. But the meeting that awaited him would mark a quiet fracture in his life. Mintz had made his move. He'd contacted Walt's animators in secret and offered them higher wages to jump ship. Most accepted. Only Iwerks and a few others stayed loyal. Mintz now claimed he owned the rights to Oswald, having registered the character under his own name through the studio's deal with Universal. Walt sat in the office, stunned, but still composed. He tried to reason, tried to salvage the partnership, but the decision was already made. He returned to the train that evening, empty-handed. The snow outside blurred the windows. He did not rant. He did not rage. Instead, he looked out into the fading twilight and began to draw. What emerged from that ride was not bitterness, but a mouse. Mickey Mouse was simple in design, but rich in spirit. He was smaller than Oswald, but more expressive. His eyes sparkled with mischief. His smile carried resilience. He looked like someone who had seen the world say no and decided to dance anyway. Walt and Ub worked quickly. They animated Plain Crazy, then The Gallopin' Gaucho. Both were silent, clever, and full of energy. But they needed something more. Sound. Talking pictures were still new, still uncertain. But Walt knew, instinctively, that animation could sing if given the chance. With their next cartoon, Steamboat Willie, they synchronized every squeak, whistle, and chuckle. Music swirled around each action. Mickey tugged ropes, spun wheels, tapped his shoes, and every movement matched a note. The first screening was held at the Colony Theater in New York. Audiences were unprepared. They gasped. They laughed. They leaned forward in delight. For the first time, a cartoon was more than drawing and motion. It was sound, soul, and playfulness in perfect time. The reviews came quickly. A marvel. The future. A tiny character with a giant heart. In a matter of weeks, Mickey Mouse became a national name. Walt returned to California with quiet satisfaction. Not because he'd won, but because he'd rebuilt something better. He didn't speak much of Mince or Oswald again. That chapter for him had closed on the train ride home. Instead, he focused on building. He signed new distribution deals. He hired fresh animators, many of them young and eager. He bought better equipment. He and Roy rented new space and expanded the studio's reach. Every morning, Mickey greeted the world from newspaper strips and theater marquees. He danced, he laughed, he endured. And through him, Walt began to explore the idea that cartoons could express not just humor, but heartache, curiosity, even longing. In Mickey's world, objects had feelings. Clouds pouted, trees clapped, music flowed from everything. It was a world where anything could happen, and often did. But behind that playfulness, Walt was pushing further. He wanted smoother motion, richer emotion. He wanted to bring animation closer to real life while still keeping its dreamlike glow. And in those early Mickey years, he found his footing, not just as a cartoonist, but as a storyteller. Mickey's rise was like the steady unfolding of morning light. One cartoon became 2, then 10, then a tide. Children laughed, adults chuckled. Even critics began to admit that these funny little films carried more than gags. They carried grace. Walt, though, never paused to bask. There was too much to do. He wanted color. He wanted movement that felt like breath. In 1932, he introduced the first color Mickey cartoon, Flowers and Trees. It was part of a series called Silly Symphonies, where music took the lead and animation danced along behind it. Flowers and Trees was unlike anything that had come before. Trees bickered and blushed. Bushes preened. A forest fire became a swirling storm of reds and oranges, and when rain finally fell, the audience sighed with relief. The film won an Academy Award, the first Oscar ever given to an animated short. Walt accepted it in a borrowed tuxedo, his voice modest and even, but his eyes alight. He wasn't chasing fame, he was chasing feeling. At the studio, the days grew longer. Animators filled the rooms with sketches and coffee cups. Music spilled from radios. Storyboards lined the walls. Walt moved from desk to desk, asking questions, making suggestions. He paced when he thought. He whistled when he dreamed. Mickey continued to star in shorts, but Walt's heart was leaning further into Silly Symphonies. They allowed space to experiment, with color, with movement, with ideas too gentle or strange for a main character. One short might follow dancing skeletons. Another might explore the seasons. Each was a little poem in paint. It was in one of those experiments that Walt found what he called the illusion of life, a way to make characters breathe, not just move, but hesitate, blink, reach. He wanted the audience to forget they were watching drawings. He called meetings, not just for deadlines, but for dreams. He encouraged animators to study animals, to act out scenes, to care about timing like musicians do. He brought in dancers, lecturers, even animals themselves, goats, cats, sometimes even deer, so the artists could see how bodies shifted and weight settled. He began to speak of a new goal, something longer, a film, an entire story told with animation alone, no actors, no backup plan. His team was startled. A full-length animated feature was unheard of, unnecessary, maybe even dangerous. The press called it Disney's folly before a frame was drawn. Even Roy, steady as ever, voiced concern. But Walt saw it already. Not just the shape of it, but the feeling. A fairy tale, yes, but also a journey. Darkness and light, laughter and fear. Something that could make people feel the way they did during a great novel or a perfect moment in a play. He chose Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, and while others braced for disaster, Walt poured every ounce of himself into it. The team was uncertain, but followed. New techniques were invented. Backgrounds were painted like watercolors left in the sun. Characters were studied from every angle. The dwarfs weren't just funny, they each had a soul. Snow White sang, moved and breathed like someone you might meet in a dream. Costs ballooned. Months slipped past. Animators went home exhausted, only to return and start again. Roy searched for funds. Walt sold his car. The studio strained, but the story grew, scene by scene. At night, when the rooms were quiet, Walt sometimes stayed behind. He'd walk the halls, look at the sketches, and hum the melodies. He didn't worry aloud. He believed in the story. That was enough. And beyond that belief, something else stirred. A sense that the world was about to change. In the quiet corner of a train car, somewhere between New York and California, a mouse was born. Not in a hospital or a storybook, but in the slow rhythm of pencil against paper. Walt sat with the curve of the window beside him, the landscape rushing by unnoticed. He was thinking, sketching, breathing through loss. The sting of Oswald's betrayal was still fresh. The character he'd built, animated, believed in, taken by contract and quiet scheming. Most would have paused, rested, looked for steady ground. But Walt was not most. Instead, he drew something new, rounder, smaller, more human in its eyes. This mouse would not just fill a space, he would fill a heart. When Walt returned to Los Angeles, he gathered what remained of his team. Just a few desks, a stack of notes. Iwerks, faithful and tireless, sat across from him. They didn't speak of Oswald anymore. They spoke of possibility. The new character was named Mickey, a name chosen not by Walt but by Lillian, who thought Mortimer sounded too proud, too distant. Mickey, she said, was softer, closer. They began at once. Plain Crazy was Mickey's first adventure, a silent whirlwind of flight and flirtation. It was playful and wild, full of daring loops and near misses. But it passed quietly. A modest reception, a few kind smiles. Walt knew it needed more. He had been watching the industry shift. Talking pictures had changed the rhythm of cinema. Sound wasn't just novelty anymore. It was expectation, and in that, Walt saw the next step. He returned with Steamboat Willie. This time, Mickey danced to music. Every whistle, every foot tap, every squeak was perfectly timed. He tugged levers and spun wheels, all in harmony with the cheerful melody. The story was light, the animation precise, and the feeling unmistakable. Audiences laughed out loud. Some leaned forward in their seats. Others clapped before the credits rolled. It was more than a cartoon. It was connection. Mickey Mouse didn't speak in those early years, not in words, but he said everything in his movements. He was mischievous but kind, brave but not without fear. He was the underdog, the dreamer, the little guy who tried again even after failing. And that, more than the gags, made people love him. As Steamboat Willie played in more theaters, Walt watched with quiet pride. Not because the mouse was a star, but because he knew now. They didn't need anyone else's characters. They could make their own. Became the quiet engine behind the movement. His hands seemed never to tire. He refined Mickey's design, smoothed his steps, brightened his expressions. The two of them worked like two sides of a single dream, Walt with the vision, with the ability to bring it to life. Roy kept the studio afloat. He negotiated contracts, calmed the books, and watched the numbers, but even he couldn't deny what was happening. Mickey Mouse had become more than a drawing. He was a symbol. Soon, they began to receive letters. Children wrote with crayons, adults with careful penmanship. They asked about Mickey's next adventure. They thanked him for the laughter. Walt read every one. In time, they expanded. More shorts followed. The barn dance, the Opry House, the haunted house, each built on the last. Mickey grew more expressive, more beloved. And with him, Walt's confidence bloomed. Not in himself, but in the art. Animation, he now believed, was more than decoration. It could tell stories that moved the spirit. And somewhere deep within, another dream was beginning to take root. The mouse had ears like perfect circles, a face so simple it could be drawn in seconds, yet it carried 1,000 expressions. With every new short, Mickey Mouse became a little more alive. And with him, so did the dream that Walt had carried since Kansas City. By 1930, Mickey was not just a film character, he was a phenomenon. Children ran through streets whistling the Steamboat Willie tune. Merchants noticed. They began to ask, could Mickey be more than a movie star? Walt hesitated. He'd built his world from sketches and reels. The idea of toys, books, or watches felt far from the art he loved. But Roy saw something else, a path that could keep the studio growing, a way to sustain the vision when ticket sales were not enough. And so the first Mickey Mouse merchandise appeared. It began with a pencil tablet, then a stuffed doll, then watches, lunchboxes, picture books. The face was everywhere, not in gaudy brightness, but in cheerful modesty. A small smile, 2 bright eyes. Walt insisted on quality. If Mickey appeared on something, it had to be good. It had to feel as joyful as the cartoons themselves. Licensing contracts were carefully reviewed. Letters were answered. Drawings refined. The studio grew. More animators joined. Ink and paint girls arrived, carefully tracing outlines onto clear cells, coloring each one by hand. The process was long, meditative. Walt would often walk through their rooms, offering praise or pointing out a smudge only he could see. Music became central. Walt hired composers and arranged for original scores. He believed that movement without melody was incomplete. In some shorts, music came first, with animators syncing their work to the rhythm. The result was something magical. In one cartoon, Mickey leads a band in a windstorm. In another, he braves haunted houses, outwits hungry cats, flies kites, and falls in love again and again with Minnie, whose voice was sweet and true, her presence gentle beside Mickey's mischief. Minnie was more than a companion. She was Mickey's balance, just as Lillian was for Walt. Their relationship, though never overly romantic, held warmth, laughter, a kind of tenderness that children sensed, even if they didn't understand it. Walt had begun voicing Mickey himself, a decision born from necessity and affection. He lent the mouse his falsetto, and through it, a deeper piece of his soul. Whenever Mickey spoke, it was Walt speaking too, quietly, cheerfully, with that slightly nervous hopefulness that had always followed him. At the same time, Walt and Roy purchased property for the studio on Hyperion Avenue. It was larger than anything they'd had before. White-walled buildings with long windows, open rooms filled with desks, cells, and the warm scent of pencil shavings. They called it the Hyperion Studio. It became a hive of energy. Animators studied real movement to make illusion more believable. They watched dancers, animals, children at play. Walt encouraged them to experiment, to exaggerate, to capture truth in every stretch and squash. And quietly, he began forming the idea that would one day change everything. A way to stretch time and feeling far beyond a few minutes of laughter. But for now, Mickey remained the heart. He was optimism in motion, a symbol that no matter how small you were, with enough spirit and cleverness, the world could be navigated. That life could be met with a smile. And as Mickey's popularity grew, Walt began to feel something deeper still. He wasn't just entertaining anymore. He was reaching people. By the early 1930s, Mickey had become more than a cartoon character. He was a fixture of American life. He grinned from storefronts, ticked time from tiny watch faces, and danced across screens in towns small and grand. But behind all the charm, Walt was already peering into the next horizon. He had never intended to stop with a mouse. At the Hyperion studio, the pace quickened. Ideas fluttered like leaves through its halls. Some became shorts, others quiet notes pinned to corkboards. Walt was always asking questions. How do we make characters more real? How can movement tell emotion? Could shadows matter as much as light? Out of this came the silly symphonies. Unlike Mickey's fast-paced antics, the symphonies were experiments, gentle, musical stories often without dialogue. In one, flowers waltzed through spring. In another, skeletons danced in moonlight. Some brought laughter, others held melancholy. But all of them carried Walt's belief that animation was not just for jokes. It could be poetry. One short, The Three Little Pigs, became an unexpected triumph. Its message, that hard work and faith could stand against any wolf, struck a chord with Depression-era audiences. The song, Who's Afraid of the Big Bad Wolf, played on radios and echoed through streets. It was lighthearted, yes, but carried courage inside. The pigs were animated with care. Each moved differently. Each felt alive. And Walt knew. The audience had begun to accept animated characters not just as images, but as people. That was the shift he had waited for. Meanwhile, Mickey continued to thrive. He starred in The Band Concert, Disney's first color Mickey short, and appeared beside Donald Duck and Goofy, both newcomers to the screen. Donald was brash, quick-tempered. Goofy, loose-limbed and affably slow. Together, they made a trio of rhythm and contrast, a perfect cartoon chorus. The team behind them swelled. Young animators joined, many barely out of school. Walt saw their potential even when their lines were shaky. He taught them not just how to draw, but how to observe. To notice the way hands moved when someone was nervous. The way laughter bent a person forward. These were the details that made drawings feel like breathing things. He brought in animals again. A calf to study walking. A bird to watch wing motion. He showed film clips, paused them frame by frame, and asked, "Do you see?" It's not just the movement, it's the feeling behind it. And they did see. The studio became a place not just of labor, but of learning. Of ambition, yes, but also of quiet care. Walt gave speeches in the break room, not of profits, but of possibilities. He told his team that one day they would make a feature-length animated film. They would tell a story that mattered, one that held joy and sorrow, danger and hope. The room would grow silent at such moments. Some thought he was dreaming too far. Others didn't know how it could be done. But Walt wasn't asking them to believe yet. He was simply planting the seed. And while he prepared the ground for that future story, Mickey remained the son they all turned toward. Cheerful, brave, and always in motion. Walt looked at him often, not with pride, but with gratitude. Because from the moment Mickey was drawn on that train, the world had begun to shift. And Walt, in the deepest corner of his being, had begun to believe that animation could do more than anyone had ever dared to think. The sun rose gently over Hyperion Avenue, casting long slats of light across the studio's courtyard. Inside, pencils tapped and film reels spun. The world outside was moving fast, But within those walls, time seemed to stretch and soften. Walt Disney walked from room to room, eyes flicking over drawings pinned to walls, listening to music hummed beneath breath, watching as motion came alive in quiet fragments. The silly symphonies had become a playground for invention. Each short was a puzzle: how to time laughter, how to stretch fear, how to move light across a painted sky. Walt loved them not just for their charm, but for what they allowed his team to explore. One day it might be the old mill, where wind creaked through broken boards and raindrops danced on spider webs. Another day it was Musicland, where entire kingdoms of instruments came to life. The stories were brief, but the ideas behind them were deep. Motion wasn't enough anymore. Walt wanted resonance. Color arrived like a quiet miracle. Using the new Technicolor process, Walt made the decision to bring hues into his world, not as decoration, but as emotion. It was a risk. Color was expensive, and few theaters could project it well. But when the colors appeared, soft greens, bright reds, deep blues, the screen felt wider, the stories fuller. Audiences gasped. Even those who didn't know why they were moved could feel it. A red rose swaying in rhythm, a blue shadow trembling. Animation had found another layer of meaning. Walt studied music too, not just melodies, but the architecture of rhythm. How laughter landed after a beat, how a surprise came best when delayed just long enough. He didn't play an instrument, but he spoke about music like someone who lived inside it. To him, a cartoon was a song you could see. The team worked tirelessly. Animators learned to draw not just motion, but gravity, eyes flicking, breath settling, a squirrel darting with a rhythm that matched a piccolo line. Scenes were reshot, then reshot again, no detail too small, no moment too brief. Walt didn't ask for perfection. He asked for feeling. Some days, he sat with the ink and paint girls and watched as they filled each cell with careful brushstrokes. Other days, he sat beside the musicians, eyes closed, tapping his fingers as if searching for something he couldn't yet hear. It wasn't always easy. He could be exacting, even impatient, but never cruel. He believed deeply, and he needed others to believe too. At home, Lillian offered quiet balance. She kept their life simple. She teased Walt when he fretted too much and reminded him that sometimes the best ideas came when he stopped thinking. Their house was modest, filled with light and silence, a place where sketches lay beside teacups, where Mickey dolls sat on bookshelves, not as trophies, but as tokens of something fragile and good. Walt began dreaming of a new kind of short, one that told more than jokes or poems, something that hinted at the shape of real stories. He spoke of wolves and witches, of forests and mirrors, of characters whose feelings could reach the audience without a single word. In the quiet corners of the studio, those ideas began to take root. But the world wasn't still. The Great Depression pressed against every business. Families watched coins more carefully. Studios shuttered. Bankers grew cautious. Yet somehow, people still came to see cartoons. Perhaps because they offered light in a time of shadow. Or perhaps because in every Mickey smile, in every pig's sturdy brick house, there was something reassuring. The belief that joy, even if drawn by hand, could still matter. And Walt, never one to sit still, was beginning to prepare for something larger than any short, something that would stretch beyond reels and laughter, a story drawn in full. The studio breathed like a living thing. Each day began with the gentle scrape of chairs, the flick of switches, the soft murmur of greetings exchanged. Animators arrived early, carrying their sketches like old friends. The ink and paint girls filtered in with quiet grace. their hands steady from hours of practice. Musicians came later, filling the air with humming and half-remembered tunes. Walt moved through it all like a conductor without a baton. He didn't need to raise his voice. His presence carried a weight, not heavy, but magnetic. When he paused beside a desk, the room seemed to settle. When he smiled, it was as if everyone breathed a little deeper. One project, the old mill, had become a kind of workshop for the future. It was a story without dialogue, just the sway of grass, the flutter of birds, the slow groan of a forgotten windmill facing a storm. But behind the scenes, it carried everything Walt hoped animation could become. It was the first to use the multiplane camera. A towering machine of metal and glass, it allowed different layers of artwork to move independently, creating depth. Backgrounds could shift as the scene moved forward. A leaf could fall past the viewer while clouds floated far behind. It was no longer a flat canvas. It was a window into a world. Walt watched the tests with arms folded, his eyes locked on the screen. When the wind picked up and the mill creaked, his throat tightened. Not from fear, but from recognition. The illusion was working. The windmill felt real, not in detail, but in feeling. He called it a milestone. Others called it a miracle. Yet even as the shorts grew in beauty and scope, Walt felt a pressure building, a quiet sense that the audience was ready for more, that his team was ready, that something longer, something deeper, was waiting just beyond the edge of what they had done before. He began to speak of a feature, a full-length animated film. The idea made some smile, others shift uncomfortably. Cartoons were 5, maybe 10 minutes long. They made people laugh, not weep. They were the opening act, not the show. Walt disagreed. He believed the audience would follow, if the story was right, if the characters breathed, if the animation could hold them gently and never let go. He chose Snow White and the 7 Dwarfs, a fairy tale known to all, a story of kindness, jealousy, fear, and love. Simple, yet rich. A chance to prove that animation could carry the weight of emotion, the tension of silence, the beauty of longing. He began quietly, building a story team. Artists gathered in long meetings, sketching scenes as Walt described them aloud. He acted out moments, shifting his voice, rising from his chair, miming expressions. They laughed, they blinked, they listened. In those sessions, the characters took shape. Snow White with her gentle voice, the Queen, cold and precise, the huntsman, trembling with mercy, and the dwarfs, each with their own rhythm, their own way of walking, speaking, breathing. No one had ever tried to do what they were about to attempt, not just in scale, but in heart. Walt insisted they couldn't rely on old tricks. Every scene had to earn its emotion. Every frame had to whisper something honest. They brought in live actors to model movements. They studied drama, light, fabric, breath. It wasn't enough for the characters to move. They had to feel as though they existed when the screen went dark. Costs soared. Animators worked through weekends. Roy searched for more financing. Some of the team began to worry. Would anyone sit through an hour of drawings? But Walt believed. And when he looked around the studio, at the rows of animators bent over their desks, the long afternoon stained with watercolor, the sound of humming from the scoring room, he saw something rare. He saw a family of artists chasing the same dream, together. The making of Snow White and the 7 Dwarfs became a kind of odyssey. It wasn't just about animation anymore. It was about scale, emotion, and belief. The team worked for months on single scenes, refining gestures, adjusting shadows, layering movement over music. Rooms once filled with laughter turned quiet as deadlines pressed closer. There were long silences, brief disagreements, and always, the slow persistence of pencil against paper. Walt kept moving. He didn't push with force, but with presence. He stopped by desks not to scold, but to ask, "What if we tried it this way?" Or simply, "How are you feeling about this one?" He knew that drawings held more truth when hands were steady and hearts were open. The story was not simple. It carried darkness, a jealous queen, a poisoned apple, a forest full of trembling trees. But it also held light, the innocence of Snow White, the kindness of 7 small souls, the power of a song sung into the empty woods. Walt made choices others wouldn't have dared. He slowed the story when it needed to breathe. He let silence sit beside sorrow. He asked the music to rise not just for dancing, but for heartbreak. He believed that children could understand more than they were given credit for, and that adults, if given the chance, could remember how to feel wonder again. The dwarfs became a world of their own. Dopey, without a word, made audiences laugh. Grumpy, despite his scowl, became beloved. Each had their own walk, their own way of blinking, their own weight. They were not jokes. They were characters. And when they wept, the audience would weep too. By late 1937, the film was nearly finished. The team was exhausted. Roy had kept the financial wolves at bay, borrowing more than he dared admit. Some said the studio wouldn't survive if the film failed. Walt didn't speak of failure. He only spoke of getting it right. The premiere was set for December at the Carthay Circle Theater. That night, Hollywood arrived in tuxedos and gowns, uncertain of what they were about to see. Celebrities filled the velvet seats. Reporters whispered. The lights dimmed. And then, it began. From the first frame, there was a hush, then laughter, then gasps. Then, toward the end, when Snow White lay still and the dwarfs surrounded her with flowers and silent grief. Tears. Real ones. Hardened studio men wiped their eyes. Actresses held their breath. And when the final scene faded into music and light, the room erupted into applause, not polite, but full, lasting. Walt sat quietly in the back. He didn't cheer. He didn't cry. He simply exhaled. The film went on to become a sensation. It played in dozens of cities. Children returned to see it again. Critics called it a masterpiece. Theaters sold out for weeks. Walt received a special Oscar, 1 full-size and 7 miniature statuettes, a nod to the story that had changed everything. The studio, once a modest space filled with folding chairs and borrowed desks, now stood as a beacon, not just for animation, but for what was possible when faith outlasted fear. Walt didn't celebrate for long. He was already thinking ahead, about a puppet who longed to be real, about a sorcerer's apprentice, about a fawn alone in the woods. But in that brief pause, as winter settled over Los Angeles and the streets shimmered with rain, he allowed himself a moment to feel what it meant to make something beautiful, and to know, quietly, deeply, that the dream he'd carried since Marceline had finally come true. Long before applause echoed through the Carthay Circle Theater, before tears welled in the corners of moviegoers' eyes, the making of Snow White and the 7 Dwarfs was a risk almost too great to name. It began with a story, simple, familiar, almost childlike in its outline, and Walt's quiet conviction that it could become something more. He didn't choose Snow White for its safety. He chose it for its soul. There were doubts from the beginning. Friends pulled him aside. Businessmen raised their eyebrows. Even Roy, who had walked with him through every storm, questioned whether the studio could survive a full-length animated feature. No one had done it before. Not in America. Not with hand-drawn scenes and voices carried on wind and music. They called it Disney's folly. But Walt didn't flinch. He saw her clearly, snow white, gentle and trusting, singing beside a well, frightened by trees that clawed like memories, comforted by friends no taller than her waist. He saw the queen, regal and cruel, the poisoned apple, the prince who arrived too late, or perhaps just in time. And around all of it, he imagined a world so rich in color, so alive with motion, that people would forget they were watching drawings at all. He began with the story. Not just the events, but the feeling. He told it out loud to the animators, moving his arms as he spoke, shifting his voice for each character. He paced the room, eyes shining, as if the film were already flickering on the wall behind him. The artists sat in quiet wonder, sketching as fast as they could, trying to keep up with the flood of ideas. Weeks turned into months. Ideas became outlines. Outlines turned into boards. Then the real work began. Every scene had to be built from silence, a blank page, a stillness that only the pencil could break. Animators studied human movement, filmed actors in costume, watched deer and rabbits, sketched trees that could sigh. They argued over angles, debated shadow, drew fingers again and again until they curled just right. The dwarfs were the heart. Each needed to feel distinct, yet part of a whole. Doc with his stumble of words, Bashful with his twisted toes, Dopey, the one without a voice, somehow saying the most. They weren't just side characters, they were family. Music followed. Walt hired composers to write themes that could carry emotion where words fell short. He sat through rehearsals with his eyes closed, swaying gently, mouthing melodies. Songs were added, not just to entertain, but to deepen the world. Someday, My Prince Will Come drifted through the studio halls like a promise. Hi-ho became a rhythm of purpose, a chant of joy. The cost of the film rose beyond anything they had imagined. $500,000, then $700,000. By the time it neared completion, it had cost nearly $1.5 million, more than any animated film had ever dreamed of. Roy stretched every account, mortgaged the future, trusted in the one thing that had never failed them: Walt's vision. Walt stopped sleeping through the night. He paced the house, his mind looping through scenes. Did the forest feel too dark? Was Snow White's voice too high? Did the Queen's transformation chill the spine just enough? He didn't want it to be good. He wanted it to be true. And deep inside, past the fear and exhaustion, he believed it could be. As the film neared completion, the studio transformed into something both frantic and tender. There was a hush in the drawing rooms, not from stillness, but from a kind of sacred focus. Each artist knew the stakes. Each line drawn was no longer just a piece of a cartoon. It was a thread in something delicate and enormous. Walt moved among them like a man with too much to say and not enough time to say it. He carried a clipboard everywhere, notes tucked between sketches. He paused beside desks, squinted at scenes through pencil-streaked lenses, asked questions that seemed simple but were never small. Does this moment feel honest? Would a child believe this look? He didn't just want a good film. He wanted a world. The dwarf's cottage was built beam by beam in watercolor. The forest was layered with fear and beauty. Leaves that whispered, branches that reached, creatures that waited and watched. Even Snow White's dress was debated. Should it shimmer or fold? Should the collar rise gently or rest flat? Walt obsessed over the Queen. She had to feel regal, untouchable, a figure carved from mirrors and snow. Her transformation into the hag was not just magic, it was decay, rot curling around beauty. The animators studied horror films, drew twisted hands, cracked teeth, eyes shadowed with hunger. But Walt insisted the fear never become cruelty. He wanted children to tremble, but never turn away. They built the sequences like music, every motion timed with care. Birds flew in arcs that matched flutes. Dwarfs tripped over logs in rhythm with drums. Tears welled not suddenly, but slowly, filling eyes before falling. The multiplane camera gave the illusion of depth, a kiss of realism that let the audience forget the drawings. Animators spent hours adjusting a single frame, a leaf fluttering, a sigh rising, a ripple in a pond as a tear fell. Color became its own character. The queen's palace gleamed in icy grays and golds. The forest breathed with emerald and dusk. Snow White glowed in soft tones, never bright, always gentle, like candlelight through silk. There were moments when Walt doubted, not loudly, not publicly, but in the quiet of his office, long after the last animator had gone home. He sometimes stared at the reels stacked on his desk and wondered whether the audience would follow. Would they stay through fear? Would they care about drawings the way he did? Then he would step back into the editing room, watch a scene, and the doubts would lift. Not all at once, but enough to move forward. There were test screenings. Some scenes failed. Some songs felt too long. Walt made cuts, adjusted dialogue, reanimated whole sequences. Not because he feared imperfection, but because the story mattered more than pride. The team grew thinner as funds ran low. Paychecks arrived late. Meals were quiet. Yet no one left. Even when deadlines loomed, even when eyes burned from long nights, they stayed. Because they weren't just making a movie. They were building something sacred. In November of 1937, the final scene was completed. Snow White, sleeping beneath glass, surrounded by 7 hearts broken open. A kiss, a breath, a slow return to life. The story had found its ending, but for Walt, it was just the beginning. The marquee glowed beneath the December sky. Outside the Carthay Circle Theater, the crowd gathered in coats and gowns, the breath of winter curling in the air. Flashbulbs sparked. Reporters jotted notes. Stars arrived in limousines, each greeted by the quiet hum of anticipation. Inside, velvet seats waited, the lights dimmed, and for a moment, the world held its breath. Snow White and the 7 Dwarfs began not with fanfare, but with the soft turning of pages, as if a story were being lifted from a well-loved book. The audience leaned in. Children widened their eyes. Grown men shifted, unsure of what to expect. As Snow White appeared, singing into the old wishing well, something gentle settled over the room. It wasn't just beauty, it was belief. Scene by scene, the film unfolded like memory. The queen, proud and glacial, gazed into her mirror. The huntsman trembled. The forest came alive with shadows. Then the cottage, a place of warmth and clutter and kindness, opened its doors. When the dwarfs sang, laughter rippled through the theater. When Dopey danced, heads tilted with affection. When Grumpy softened, eyes misted. And when the poisoned apple fell from Snow White's fingers, silence. Children clutched their parents' hands. Adults forgot themselves. As the dwarfs mourned, the entire room mourned with them. But then came the kiss. Software brief. Honest. Snow White's eyes opened. The spell lifted. The story, so tenderly built, came home to its final breath. The audience rose in applause that didn't end with the credits. It continued outside, into the cold night, into headlines the next morning. Disney does it. a triumph of art and imagination. Even the most skeptical critics bowed. Cartoons, once seen as comic interludes, had become cinema. Walt had crossed a threshold no one thought existed. Back at the studio, the team gathered around radios, reading reviews aloud, laughter breaking through tears. Many hadn't even seen the finished film. They had been too deep inside it to know how it would land. Walt, ever quiet in his victories, celebrated with his closest team. He shook hands. He smiled. But even as the film climbed box office charts, even as he stood on stage accepting the special Oscar, a full-size statue beside 7 tiny ones, he was already thinking of the next idea. What could follow a fairy tale? The answer, it turned out, was everything. The studio would never be the same. Snow White had earned not just praise, but security. It paid off debts, brought in new opportunities, opened the door to a new campus. Walt planned a state-of-the-art studio in Burbank. Wide halls, natural light, space for ideas to breathe. But more than that, Snow White proved something fragile and lasting, that an audience, if trusted, would follow a feeling, that drawings could carry truth, that a man from Marceline could draw a dream large enough for the world to step inside. In the months that followed, children hummed hi-ho as they walked to school. Toy stores filled with Snow White dolls. The Queen's silhouette appeared in parades. And somewhere in the quiet rooms of the Hyperion studio, Walt turned another page. A boy made of wood, a sorcerer's hat, a deer in a clearing. The stories were waiting, and Walt, finally standing on the other side of a dream, was ready to meet them. In the early months of 1938, the world felt wide and bright. Snow White and the 7 Dwarfs was still playing in theaters, still pulling in crowds who came to laugh, cry, and marvel. Inside the Disney studio, sunlight streamed through windows, and the scent of fresh paper and paint hung gently in the air. For the first time, there was breathing room. Walt didn't pause long. He turned, as always, toward what came next. He spoke of new projects not as options, but as promises. The next film would be Pinocchio, a wooden puppet yearning to be real. After that, Fantasia, a symphony of sound and vision unlike anything ever made. There would be Bambi, quiet and poetic, and Dumbo, small in size but large in heart. The staff had grown. The new Burbank campus, funded by Snow White's success, was more than a workplace. It was a campus of possibility. High windows, courtyards, sound stages. The studio had come alive, but so had the pressure. Walt now oversaw hundreds of employees. Each film required more money, more time, more detail. Animators studied anatomy, light, movement. They filmed animals walking, shadows shifting through forest canopies. Scenes were drawn, then redrawn. Watercolored skies were layered over pencil dreams. And still, Walt asked for more. Not because he demanded perfection, but because he saw it, the version that lived in his mind, clear and complete. He wanted his team to see it too. Pinocchio became a journey of complexity. The story wove through joy and danger, temptation and hope. The puppet's face was difficult to animate, too wooden, and he lost empathy. Too soft, and he stopped looking carved. Jiminy Cricket evolved from a lumpy insect to the bright-eyed conscience we now know. Walt oversaw it all, each change, each tweak, each tiny breath. The film opened in 1940 to glowing praise. Critics marveled at the fluid animation, the depth of its story. But the box office was quiet. Overseas markets, essential to success, were closing as Europe fell into war. Walt didn't show disappointment. He pressed forward. Fantasia followed that same year, a collaboration with conductor Leopold Stokowski. It was not a film in the usual sense. It had no dialogue, no single story, just music. Great sweeping pieces by Bach, Tchaikovsky, Stravinsky, paired with bold, imaginative visuals. Abstract shapes danced. Dinosaurs fought. A mouse summoned stars with a wizard's hat. Walt believed it would change how people thought about movies, but the public was unsure. Some were enchanted, others confused. Sound systems in many theaters couldn't support the rich stereophonic sound Walt had insisted on. Financially, it faltered. Inside the studio, murmurs began. The pace was relentless, expectations high, hours long. Walt, once the cheerful engine of the team, became harder to reach. He drifted into solitude, walking the halls alone, thinking. He wasn't angry, he was searching. He believed deeply in the work, but success, he was learning, didn't always come where it was earned, and the clouds were gathering. A storm, slow and silent, was moving toward the studio gates. The winds began quietly. It started with whispers in the break rooms, pauses in the hallways, conversations held a little too long behind closed doors. The studio was expanding, but not everyone felt it. Hours were long, expectations were high, and the distance between Walt and his artists had grown wider. They still admired him, but they no longer saw him as often. He was in meetings. He was thinking ahead. His vision now spanned continents and decades, but to those working late into the night, what they needed was someone to hear their exhaustion. A labor strike had been stirring in Hollywood. Other studios had faced similar unrest. The Screen Cartoonists Guild had formed, and some of Walt's animators, people who had drawn beside him in the lean years, began to join. Walt was blindsided. He had always seen the studio as a family, not perfect, but bonded by purpose. To him, the halls of Burbank were more than a workplace. They were the embodiment of everything he'd built from the ground up. The idea that his own artists, his friends, could feel wronged was painful in a way he didn't know how to express. But the distance had taken root. In the spring of 1941, the strike began. Picket lines formed outside the gates. Placards with cartoon faces, Mickey, Donald, Goofy, marched in silent protest. Artists who had once shared coffee and laughter now stood on opposite sides of the studio's fence. Walt was devastated. He paced his office, looking down through the windows. He wrote memos. He gave speeches. He took it personally, because for him, it was personal. These weren't strangers. These were people who had drawn Dopey's smile, who had inked Snow White's tears. And now they were gone. The strike lasted weeks. Walt tried to reason. He tried to wait. But the tension grew. Eventually, outside mediators stepped in. Agreements were made. Animators returned, but the warmth was slower to follow. Walt had changed, not in cruelty, but in caution. He withdrew from the everyday rhythm of the studio. He delegated more. He traveled, and quietly, he carried the bruise. Meanwhile, Dumbo, the studio's next film, was taking shape. In many ways, it was a return to simplicity. The story of an elephant with ears too large, a heart too soft, and courage no one expected. It was short, emotional, made on a tighter budget. And when it premiered, audiences wept, especially at the scene where Dumbo's mother, locked in chains, cradles her baby through the bars with her trunk. The lullaby that plays, soft and aching, became one of the most beloved moments in all of Disney's work. The film was a modest success, and for Walt, it was a quiet balm. But the world outside was shifting. War loomed. Europe was darkening. In December 1941, the attack on Pearl Harbor pulled America into the conflict. The film industry changed overnight. Budgets vanished. staff left to enlist. The studio, barely steady again, found itself adrift. Walt accepted contracts from the U.S. government to produce training and propaganda films. The tone shifted. Mickey and Donald were drafted, saluting, marching, urging war bonds. It wasn't the work Walt dreamed of, but it kept the studio alive. Beneath it all, he still dreamed of Bambi. A fawn in a forest, the hush of snow, the echo of loss. The film was years in the making. Scenes were drawn and redrawn. Backgrounds were painted with an attention that bordered on reverence. Animators studied deer in meadows. They watched how their hooves touched the earth, how they looked before running, how they stood when sensing danger. When Bambi finally premiered in 1942, critics praised its artistry, but the box office was quiet. Again. Walt didn't flinch. He just turned the page. The war years reshaped everything. The Disney studio, once a beacon of imagination, now wore the drab hues of necessity. Soldiers visited. Barbed wire framed parts of the campus. Uniformed guards replaced ushers. Animators, many still young, turned from fairy tales to film reels filled with military briefings and animated warnings. Walt watched it all with a steady heart. He understood the moment. He believed in service. But the shift weighed on him. The halls no longer echoed with song. The characters he loved were now messengers of wartime urgency. He tried to keep a corner of the studio soft, a place for future dreams. In the midst of the chaos, a project called Saludos Amigos emerged, a goodwill film sponsored by the U.S. government to foster friendship with South American countries. Walt and a team of artists, musicians, and writers toured Brazil, Argentina, Chile, and beyond. They sketched dancers, mountains, birds with emerald wings. They shared stories, colors, rhythms. It was part diplomacy, part escape. Walt returned with notebooks full of characters. The film and its follow-up, The Three Caballeros, were bursts of color and cheer in a world gripped by shadows. Not perfect, not deeply profound, but joyful, bright, necessary. At home, the studio's identity shifted. No longer just the house of Mickey and Snow White. It was now something adaptable, resilient, capable of making a musical or a manual, a lullaby or a lesson. Through it all, Walt kept thinking, even in moments of fatigue, and there were many. He carried in his mind a future that shimmered with shapes and sounds no one else could yet see. He thought of a world where fantasy didn't stop at the edge of the screen. He thought of places people could walk into, where you didn't just see the dream, you stepped inside it. It was only an idea then, a thread, but it was there, soft and persistent. Back on screen, Mickey had begun to fade. Other characters had risen in his place, Donald with his stammering outbursts, Goofy with his loping charm, Pluto with his loyal heart. They carried the audience through lean years. Walt didn't mind. Mickey had never been meant to rule forever. He had been a key. And now, new doors had opened. As the war ended and the world exhaled, Walt stood again at the edge of possibility. Older now, a little more lined around the eyes, a little quieter, but the spark, that same spark that flickered in Marceline, that danced between pencil strokes in Kansas City, still glowed. The golden age of animation had passed through storms, strikes, and shadows, but it had not dimmed. It had grown stronger. And Walt, standing amid blueprints and sketches and the faint hum of film reels turning, was ready once more to imagine forward. The war had ended, and with it came a quieter world, one filled with rebuilding, reflection, and small beginnings. For Walt, it was also a moment of renewal. The studio had survived, not unscarred, but still standing. And though the audience had changed, he believed their hunger for wonder had not. Still, Walt knew the movies were no longer enough. He had begun to feel it during the long nights, when he walked past sleeping storyboards and sat alone at his desk. The screen had limits. It could stir the heart, yes. It could lift laughter from sorrow. But when the lights rose, the dream always ended. He began imagining something different, a place, a real place, not just to watch the story, but to live inside it. The first seeds of Disneyland came to him in small, scattered thoughts. A bench in Griffith Park, where he watched his daughters ride the carousel. They laughed, spinning, unaware of the time. Walt sat there, quietly, as he often did, his mind drifting beyond the music and the paint-chipped horses. What if there were a place where families could stay together? Not one child here, one parent there. Not a dusty carnival or a noisy fair, but a world, clean, kind, filled with charm. A place where dreams didn't end when the film did. He jotted ideas on napkins, scraps of paper, the back pages of sketchbooks. It started with a small park beside the studio, a modest idea. A few rides, a train, a place to meet Mickey and wander gardens. But it grew. In his mind, pathways curved into a central plaza. Castles rose in the distance. Rivers flowed past paddle boats. The past and future lived side by side. He spoke to Roy, carefully at first, then with urgency. Roy was skeptical. The studio had only just regained its footing. A theme park? It was a gamble larger than any film they'd ever made. But Walt was persistent. Not reckless, just certain. He sought advice from architects, engineers, even amusement park owners. He listened. He learned. He pushed. The word impossible never held much weight with him. Financing was the largest hurdle. Walt knew the banks wouldn't fund fantasy, so he turned to a new medium, television. It was still young, unpredictable, but Walt saw its potential. In exchange for funding, he offered ABC exclusive rights to a new weekly show. It would be part entertainment, part education, and part promotion for his park. The show, Disneyland, premiered in 1954. It brought viewers into Walt's world. He appeared on screen, soft-voiced and smiling, walking them through plans, dreams, even mistakes. The nation watched as castles took shape, trains were tested, and stories began to breathe. Children pointed at the screen. Parents took notice. And behind it all, bulldozers carved rivers, steel-framed towers, and painters worked through the night in a quiet patch of Anaheim. Walt visited often, not to oversee, but to dream alongside. He walked the dirt paths, now turned to pavement. He climbed scaffolding. He knelt to inspect tiles, tested popcorn machines, rode unfinished tracks. He noticed everything. He believed that the smallest things carried the most magic, and he wanted it all. The sights, the sounds, the smells, to feel just right. He didn't want to escape reality. He wanted to offer a better one. By the summer of 1955, the dream had shape. Disneyland stood at the edge of Orange County, rising from former farmland like something out of storybooks. The castle gleamed at its center, not tall by later standards, but perfect in proportion, a beacon that pulled the eye and softened the breath. Paths curled outward from the hub, each leading to a different realm. Main Street, USA, with its gingerbread trim and sweet windows, welcomed visitors into an idealized past. Gas lamps flickered, horse-drawn trolleys clattered, and the scent of baked goods curled from unseen ovens. Adventureland beckoned with jungle calls and overgrown temples. Frontierland stretched wide with rivers and wooden forts, Tomorrowland glowed with chrome edges and promises of rockets, and nestled like a gentle sigh, Fantasyland held the stories: Snow White, Peter Pan, Mr. Toad, each ride a whisper of celluloid turned real. Opening day came on July 17th, 1955. The air was thick with heat. Asphalt, poured just hours earlier, softened underfoot. The live television broadcast beamed coast to coast. Walt stood in front of Sleeping Beauty Castle, coat buttoned, eyes gleaming beneath the sun. He spoke softly, his voice almost hesitant. To all who come to this happy place, welcome. It wasn't a performance, it was a benediction. And though the day was far from perfect, rides broke down, water fountains failed, crowds spilled far beyond expectations, none of that mattered to Walt, because the gates had opened, and the dream was walking. Children tugged their parents forward. Ice cream melted over fingers. Donald waved from a parade float. Bands played on the steps of the train station. Laughter rang down Main Street. Behind the scenes, Walt moved like a shadow. He checked trash bins, tasted hot dogs, adjusted music volume. He noticed peeling paint and asked for it to be touched up by morning. He told workers to smile, not because it was policy, but because joy, he believed, was contagious. Each morning after opening, he arrived early and walked the park, alone. He ran his fingers along railings, tapped doors, listened, not for complaints, but for silence. He wanted to know what the park felt like when it was still, to understand how it breathed. At home, he smiled more. Lillian noticed it. His daughter saw it too. Walt was still dreaming, still drawing, still immersed in film. But something about Disneyland softened him. Here, he didn't need to convince anyone of magic. It surrounded him. The park was not just a business. It was a place he could visit. One where he could see, with his own eyes, a mother and daughter holding hands in Fantasyland, a boy gasping at a jungle boat's roar, a teenager for a moment, forgetting to be bored. The cast members, employees in costumes, became part of the family. Walt knew many by name. He rode the rides, he queued with guests, he spoke not from above, but beside. Disneyland, he would later say, would never be finished, because imagination never rests. As the months passed, Disneyland settled into its own rhythm, not fixed, but flowing. Seasons changed. Trees filled in. Paint deepened. Visitors returned again and again, chasing memories that always felt just around the next corner. Walt treated the park like a story still being written. He adjusted signs, added benches, repainted facades under moonlight. When he saw a child struggling to see a parade, he made note of curb heights. When a boat docked too roughly, he altered the landing. He wasn't just preserving the dream, he was tending it. New lands were imagined. He spoke of a haunted house, not terrifying, but curious. Of pirates singing as they sailed. Of a mountain with a bobsled. Ideas tumbled from his mouth like coins into a wishing well, each one ringing with possibility. And slowly, they came to life. He worked with engineers, who he called Imagineers, blending art and science, story and steel. They solved puzzles no one had solved before. How to make a ghost appear and vanish in the same breath. How to build a mountain in a flatland. How to let people fly without wings. Walt walked with them, sketched beside them, believed when they doubted. When the Mickey Mouse Club launched on television, it deepened the connection. Children saw themselves on screen, cheerful, brave, part of the magic. They wore mouse ears, sang songs, begged their parents to take them to Anaheim. Disneyland became more than a park. It became a pilgrimage. But Walt never let it harden into something static. He knew wonder required motion. He added the monorail, sleek and futuristic, the Matterhorn, snow-capped and thrilling, the submarine voyage, mysterious and slow. He told stories through rides, through food, through carefully chosen background music. No corner was too small to care about. He believed deeply that people could feel intention, even if they couldn't name it, that the choice of a paint color, the angle of a window, the scent near a bakery, all of it whispered, "You are welcome here." At night, after the fireworks had faded and the lights dimmed, Walt sometimes stood in the upper window above the firehouse on Main Street. The apartment he'd built there was modest, just a small space to rest. But from that window, he could see the whole of his dream breathing below. He didn't speak often of what it meant, but he felt it. He saw a father holding his child, pointing toward Tomorrowland, a teenager leaning out of a teacup, a grandmother sitting on a bench with a churro in her hand, smiling as music drifted past. That, to Walt, was magic, not illusion, but intention, care, and love, wrapped in color and music and motion. He often said that Disneyland was built for the child in all of us, and as he stood there, watching lights blink one by one into darkness, he seemed to become that child again, wide-eyed, hopeful, quietly certain that if you dream carefully enough, the world will listen. The 1960s arrived not with a bang, but with a gentle hum of promise. Across the country, televisions flickered with Walt's calm voice. He spoke not just as a filmmaker now, but as a guide, someone ushering families toward adventure, knowledge, and wonder, one carefully crafted episode at a time. Disneyland was thriving, but Walt's eyes had never stayed long in one place. He had begun to think outward, across oceans, and into futures not yet written. He wanted to build something even bigger, not just parks, but possibilities. First came film. The live-action division bloomed. Swiss Family Robinson, Pollyanna, Old Yeller, each told with simplicity and warmth, each stitched with threads of hope and heartache. They were not flashy. They were human. And audiences, especially families, leaned in. But one film would rise above them all, Mary Poppins. Walt had chased the rights to P.L. Travers' book for over 20 years. The author had resisted. She feared her character would be softened, her story diluted. But Walt persisted, gently, patiently, writing letters, visiting in person, offering not control, but care. Eventually, she relented. The production was bold. Animation and live action, song and story, whimsy and sorrow, all balanced on the tip of an umbrella. Walt assembled a dream team. Julie Andrews, luminous and firm as the magical nanny. Dick Van Dyke, cheerful and spry, leaping through chalk drawings. The Sherman brothers composed songs that slipped quietly into the fabric of American memory. Feed the Birds, A Spoonful of Sugar, Let's Go Fly a Kite. Walt watched the scenes unfold with a quiet joy, not because they dazzled, but because they meant something. When Mary Poppins premiered in 1964, it soared. Critics called it enchanting. Audiences returned again and again. It earned 13 Academy Award nominations and won 5. But for Walt, the greatest reward was quieter. A child humming Chim Chim Chair-E in a schoolyard, a family walking home with a smile. Still, Walt didn't pause, not for long. He turned next to the 1964 New York World's Fair. There, the company was invited to build attractions for several pavilions, new chances to tell stories not just in film, but in space. It's a Small World, with its message of unity and peace, its pastel figures and lilting tune, became a gentle anthem for togetherness. Great Moments with Mr. Lincoln brought history to life through audio animatronics, a word Walt coined for figures that could move and speak, mechanical yet full of feeling. Walt stood quietly during the first Lincoln test, watching the figure rise from its chair, straighten its coat, and speak. He didn't smile. He didn't applaud. He simply nodded. Because for him, this was the future. Story and space, heart and machine, together. By the mid-1960s, Walt Disney was no longer just a name on a theater screen. He was a voice in living rooms, a dreamer who had become something of a guide for a generation. His parks, his films, his shows, they didn't just entertain. They reassured. They reminded people, gently and firmly, that goodness still mattered. But Walt wasn't finished building. Not even close. In quiet meetings and over stacks of drawings, he began speaking of something new. Not a film, not a park, a city. Not just streets and shops, but a living place. A place that worked, that learned, that adjusted. A place where technology didn't overshadow life. It illuminated it. He called it EPCOT, the experimental prototype community of tomorrow. The idea shimmered somewhere between science and story. Walt imagined a circular city with green belts and schools, homes and monorails, climate-controlled shopping and clean energy. He envisioned a hub that rotated with the hours, where innovation flowed as freely as conversation. It wasn't utopia. It was function, powered by imagination. And unlike the parks, Epcot wouldn't be frozen in fantasy. It would evolve. It would never be finished. Walt knew it was a dream that asked everything: money, time, belief. But he had built from less before. He began to look for land, and he found it. A stretch of flat, forested earth in central Florida, humid and wide, with space enough for 1,000 dreams. Quietly, his team acquired parcels under different names. It took months, but soon they owned nearly 30,000 acres, double the size of Manhattan. It was more than a project. It was legacy. In the midst of planning, Walt continued working on other pieces. Disneyland kept growing. Animatronics advanced. More films took shape. The Jungle Book began quietly, and Walt watched with particular care. He wanted it light, musical, even playful, a contrast to the war-weary air of the moment. The songs, crafted by the Sherman brothers, carried joy beneath their rhythm. But even as he shaped these works, those around him noticed changes. He moved more slowly, took longer pauses, lost weight. He waved away concern. There was still too much to do. Still, in the autumn of 1966, he went for tests. The diagnosis came with sharp edges: lung cancer. He kept it private. Only a few knew. His brother, his wife, a small circle at the studio. He didn't speak of it in meetings. He didn't mention it on set. He continued to show up, to review drawings, to revise models of Epcot and Disney World. He asked for a hospital bed to be placed where he could see the blueprints. Lying there, he looked up at the ceiling, where someone had taped concept art of EPCOT above his head. Even in rest, he was dreaming forward. December came quietly to Los Angeles in 1966. The trees along the studio grounds had turned brittle and gold, and the air carried the faint scent of winter. Inside the hospital, Walt Disney's world had grown smaller, yet his thoughts remained wide. Visitors came and went gently. Roy sat beside him, mostly in silence. The bond between the brothers, once held in contracts and shared risks, had grown into something deeper, built not just on business, but on quiet understanding. Roy didn't ask questions. He knew Walt was still building, even now. Walt would look toward the ceiling, tracing lines in the air, describing layouts for Epcot in soft, short bursts. The monorail goes here. Shops curve around like this. The hotel should sit just beyond the lake. Nurses said they often found pencil marks on the sheets. The studio, still humming with work, waited without quite knowing what to expect. Word had begun to spread, not in memos or announcements, but in the way people moved, softer, slower, as if the building itself sensed a change approaching. Walt passed away on the morning of December 15th, 1966. The news was simple. Walt Disney has died. But the echo of it reached farther than anyone could measure. Around the country, children asked their parents why. Families sat quietly during dinner. Newspaper presses ran stories with photographs of castles, mice, and a man who had imagined the impossible and brought it to life. The studio stopped for a moment, then resumed, not out of indifference, but in tribute. Because Walt would have wanted the work to continue, not as routine but as rhythm, as forward motion. Roy, though older and ready for retirement, made a decision. He would not leave, not yet. Walt's final dream, the Florida project, needed someone to carry it across the finish line. Roy took up the plans. He flew east. He walked the fields Walt had only seen from the air. And when ground was broken, he gave it a name. Not Disney World, but Walt Disney World, so people would remember whose dream had planted it. The studio carried on. The Jungle Book released the following year, a soft musical exhale after the grief. It was the last animated feature Walt had touched, and audiences felt it. The warmth, the wit, the quiet knowing of childhood and change. At Disneyland, cast members lit an extra lamp in the apartment above the firehouse, the one Walt had used during those early nights. It glowed softly each evening, a quiet reminder. The world Walt had built, of dreams, of stories, of music and movement, did not end with him, because he had built it to last beyond one man, not in stone, but in the hearts of those who believed. And as long as they did, he would never be far away. In the quiet months after Walt's passing, the air around the Disney studio felt suspended, like a breath held too long. There were projects in motion, drawings on desks, reels waiting to be edited. But something had shifted. The man who had always stood just ahead of the dream was gone. Yet his voice lingered. In story meetings, someone would ask, what would Walt have said? Not in worship, but in rhythm, as if his way of seeing the world still echoed through every hallway and sketch. Roy, once the quieter brother, stepped forward. He had never asked for the spotlight. He preferred the ledgers, the planning, the grounding, but he had made a promise. And that promise now pulled him east, to the fields of Florida. The land was still wild, swamps and pine, flat stretches of sky, a place where storms gathered without warning and the air hung thick with humidity. But to Walt, it had been a blank page, and Roy would see it through. Construction on Walt Disney World began in 1967. Roy oversaw it all, not as Walt would have, with sketchpad in hand and wonder in his eyes, but with steadiness. He listened to the engineers. He reviewed the blueprints. He walked the land, hands in pockets, lips pressed in thought. He changed, too. More open, more present, as if carrying Walt's dream had unlocked something inside him. The plans for Epcot, Walt's city of the future, were set aside, not erased, just postponed. Roy knew the world wasn't ready to build a city yet, but they could build the beginning, a park, a resort, a world where guests could step into the stories that Walt had spent a lifetime shaping. He made a decision. It would not be called Disney World. That, he said, sounded too easy. It would be Walt Disney World, so that everyone would know whose vision had made it rise from the earth. In California, the studio pressed on. The animators who had grown under Walt's gaze now carried the work forward. They were older, more assured, but every now and then, as a line of pencil curled across paper, one might pause and smile. Walt would have liked that, they'd say. The company continued to grow. Live-action films, television specials, educational programming, nature documentaries, all of it carried that same gentle signature, the belief that stories could shape the world, not just reflect it. At Disneyland, the lamp above the firehouse window still glowed. Children still gasped at the first sight of the castle. And Roy, thousands of miles away, watched as steel became scaffolding, scaffolding became buildings, and buildings became magic. Walt Disney World opened on October 1st, 1971. It was a soft morning, the kind where the light hangs low and gentle over the land. The gates opened quietly. No television broadcast, no sweeping fanfare, just families stepping into something bigger than themselves. They walked along tidy paths. They gasped at Cinderella Castle, its spires brushing the pale blue sky. Music drifted from hidden speakers. Gardens bloomed in careful colors. Rides twirled. Smiles gathered. Roy Disney stood beside his wife, eyes damp, his hand resting on the railing. He had made it. He had finished the dream. Not perfectly, but faithfully. He gave a speech, brief and quiet, and ended with words that hung like mist in the air. Walt Disney World is a tribute to the philosophy and life of Walter Elias Disney, and to the talents, the dedication, and the loyalty of the entire Disney organization. He paused, and to the memory of the man who inspired it all. A few months later, Roy passed away. Some said he had held on just long enough, that once he had honored his brother's legacy, his heart finally rested. In the shadow of the castle, the two brothers' stories had come full circle, one building the dream, the other planting it firmly in the world. Walt Disney World grew, so did the company. Decades followed, new leaders, new lands, new characters. Yet in every parade, in every animated tier, in every shared laugh beneath fireworks, a part of Walt's vision endured. Epcot, in time, would be reimagined, not as a city, but as a theme park, still carrying the spirit of Walt's hope, that progress and peace could walk side by side. At the studio, the next generation rose. They studied the old sketches. They whispered his name with reverence. They dared to imagine boldly, because he had taught them how. But perhaps Walt's truest legacy was not the films or the parks or the profits. It was the feeling that the world, no matter how weary, could be met with kindness, that joy, shared gently, could endure, and that inside every person, no matter their age or worry, lived a spark of wonder waiting to be kindled. Somewhere, a child still watches Steamboat Willie for the first time, still walks through castle gates, still believes. And in that quiet believing, Walt Disney lives on.